combining those three speakers in the morning really, I think, illustrates what this Congress is trying to do, which is trying to connect people and share information and do all those good things that we know effective counterterrorism depends on. But in that respect, I'd also like to commend to you your fellow members of the audience, because a lot of you here have a considerable experience of counterterrorism as well, sometimes in niche areas, sometimes more general. So I do encourage you to take full advantage of the various breaks and so on to talk to other people and learn from them as well and share your ideas. But anyway, rather than delay further, let me introduce Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley, a really great policeman, an enormous contribution he's made to British counterterrorism and indeed beyond in the United Kingdom as well. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, thank you to the Security and Counterterrorism Expo for setting this all up today and allowing me to speak. And I'm delighted to speak to you today in what's the final week of my police service, so this feels very odd. I promise not to well up during the speech too much. It's been a privilege, 31 years in policing, from the streets of Digbeth in Birmingham, where I first walked the beat, to being at Scotland Yard and being the head of counter-terrorism. Indeed, last week, as a bit of a reminiscence, I actually went out on patrol in Birmingham Town Centre, where I started my career, which was, it was great to go out with two young officers and see how much the world's changed since I was there. I've tried to persuade Dave Thompson, the Chief Constable of West Midlands, that the absence of any crime at all in the city centre on last Wednesday night was down to my outstanding policing skills. His view, though, is that it was -5 and there was actually nobody else in the town centre, but I'm sticking to my version of the story. So, today, it's an honour to have led this, this contribution the police makes to the national fight against international and domestic terrorism. And this morning, I think everyone here will be well versed in the threats to some degree, so I don't intend to go into great detail. But what I do want to do is to describe the threat from terrorism and the threat from extremism, and there's a distinction between, I want to describe them both, and from both an Islamist and from right-wing ideologies, and then talk about how they translate operationally. And I'll then be expanding on what I see as the required whole society response, what's needed to take on these challenges, and in particular, what's required from the private sector to help us all meet these challenges in our communities. So on the threat from terrorism, October last year, Andrew Parker, Director General of MI5, said of the threat from international terrorism, today there is more terrorist activity coming at us more quickly, and it can be harder to detect. It's multidimensional, evolving rapidly, and operating at a scale and pace that we've not seen before. So just take that in, sort of travelling more quickly, harder to detect. And as we approach the first anniversary of the terror attack in Westminster, we look back on an extraordinary and one of the most challenging of years. Tragically, of course, we saw 5 terror attacks, 4 Islamist in origin and 1 extreme right wing, leaving a total of 36 people dead and hundreds more injured. And at the same time last year, we also saw a wholly unprecedented number of plots prevented in the UK. In total, since the Westminster attack, MI5 and police have foiled 14 other plots. 10 were Islamist in origin, and as I announced last week, 4 had their roots in extreme right-wing ideology. I think the right-wing issues have been underplayed publicly. It is the smaller part of the threat, but it is growing, and I think it needs to be a matter of concern to all of us that those statistics I've given you, and that behind them we have a homegrown, prescribed terrorist organisation that is proudly neo-Nazi and white supremacist. That hasn't had the pickup that it deserves as part of the challenges that we all need to collectively be alive to and wrestle with. So then to move on and summarise the threat from extremism. Whilst the threat from terrorism I would describe as acute, the challenges presented by extremism are what I would call chronic. And whilst extremism causes many social ills, it's of a particular concern to me and the people I work with because it creates a fertile environment that allows the acute threat of terrorism to exist and thrive. Indeed, extremism in communities helps provide a recruiting ground for terrorists. And I see extremists from the Islamist and far-right ideologies both executing a common strategy. Empirically, as a practitioner, I see them doing four things in our communities. Is there some water, please? I see them doing four things in our communities. Firstly, extremists reach into communities through sophisticated propaganda. Secondly, they create... Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Apologies for that. Thank you, Richard. This is where I realise I haven't got enough hands, but never mind. So, four components I was just describing of the strategies that I see extremists of both persuasions operating with. So firstly, extremists reach into communities with sophisticated propaganda. Secondly, extremists create intolerance and isolation. Thank you. Intolerance and isolation by generating distrust of state institutions. And thirdly, they then offer warped parallel alternatives that undermine our values of tolerance and diversity. This then helps create isolated and fearful settings for terrorists to step into, whether it's in person or online, to inspire often vulnerable people to carry out attacks. And I now consider that the fight against extremism is as important as that against terrorism. I'm not going to expand on that further, but I spoke last week and expanded quite widely on how extreme right-wingers and those of an Islamist ideology, with different tactics, try and achieve the same ends in communities. So what are the operational consequences of these twin threats of extremism and terrorism, and how is it affecting our day-to-day work? So, at this time, we now have over 600 investigations covering Islamist and extreme right-wing and other motivations. And they comprise more than 3,000 subjects of interest. And we also have a legacy of 20,000 individuals who featured in past MI5 and police investigations. And then the consequence of that is over the last 4 years, in my time as head of UK counter-terrorism policing, we've more than doubled our arrests. That's the level of work rate that's changed. And that's produced 587 charges and 478 convictions for counter-terrorism related offences. Looking more broadly than just pursuing the offenders, we've also worked with partners on prevent interventions, reducing the vulnerability of around 2,000 people in the last 3 years of both Islamist and extreme right-wing ideologies. And in addition, since the start of the Syria conflict, there have been around 100 children that have been safeguarded through the family courts based on information provided by counter-terrorism police, MI5 and other partners. So those just headline numbers start to illustrate the increased demand that we now have and how much we have to stretch to cover this additional volume, and in an environment where plots develop more rapidly and conspirators can work in secret and online. Whilst the upshifting threat has significantly increased the demands on us, it is critical that we now strive to improve and learn lessons. The strength of our counter-terrorism model in the UK is based on that constant determination to learn lessons. And so last year, after the attacks, ourselves and MI5 together commissioned what we called an operational improvement review, which, under the independent scrutiny of David Anderson, proposed 3-step changes. The first responds to the growing extreme right-wing terror threat that I've already highlighted, and plans to bring the skills and techniques of MI5 to the fight alongside the police. The second step change aims to improve the capability especially in areas of data analytics, to spot behavioural escalation within that very large cohort of former subjects of interest and beyond. That's the 20,000 I spoke about and beyond. The third step change proposes going beyond existing national security community relationships to involve and enable the widest range of local partners to play their part in managing the risk from subjects of interest, current and former, and those reactivating their extremist activities. A key underpinning principle behind these step changes is to better connect, pursue and prevent activity, to better manage those hovering between radicalised and mobilised. So as we learn and look forward, I would like to make the point, though, that I think there are many reasons we should be optimistic in the nation's ability to confront the acute threat we face from terrorism. I've got 5 points I'd briefly make. Firstly, we do benefit from a fantastically mature national security infrastructure. Counter-terrorism and policing and MI5 have built a very effective and capable partnership, probably the closest in the world, that allows us to jointly confront a range of threats, including Islamist, Irish, Republican and extreme right-wing terrorism. Second, we have political support and legal tools. We've been fortunate to have had successive governments over many years from different political sides investing in counter-terrorism capabilities, providing and continually refreshing the sound legal framework that we need in order for us to do our job. Third, we have a low availability of firearms in the UK. The relative difficulty in procuring such weapons in Great Britain is an advantage we must sustain. We are not complacent, and we work tirelessly with the National Crime Agency, Border Force and other partners to make it as difficult as possible for terrorists to get hold of any weaponry. Fourth, we are of course an island nation with strong borders, and that provides an obvious advantage when it comes to the movements of terrorists and material in and out of the country. That of course doesn't remove the requirement though for strong partnerships with international counterparts, both in Europe and beyond. And then last but not least of my 5 advantages is the age-old strength of the British model of community policing and the trust and legitimacy that it secures. The founder of British policing, Sir Robert Peel, said in 1829, "The police are the public and the public are the police." For me, that principle is as true today as it was nearly 200 years ago, and we've invested heavily in our community engagement, which is why public confidence in policing and indeed the specialists in counter-terrorism policing remains high. So, having summarised the challenges we face from terrorism and from extremism, I wanted to go on to the whole society response and what I mean by that. So as we reflect on and learn on what occurred last year, and because I've described the upshift in the threat is multidimensional and evolving rapidly, and operating at a scale and pace we haven't seen before, we are considering what we must do to confront this threat. Last week, delivering the Colin Crampall Memorial Lecture at Policy Exchange, I set out what I saw as the need for a whole society response. I want to provoke a debate about what we as a society can collectively do to make it even harder for terrorists and extremists to succeed. That means every part of society, not simply those charged with national security responsibilities, coming together to have a more effective counter-terrorism machine. We need a machine that has the full buy-in of national and local government, universities and schools, healthcare and social services, the media and social media, prisons and offender management institutions, commercial, retail and communication sectors, and the third sector involving charities and civil society groups, working together to keep the UK safer. Today, though, given the audience, I would like to expand upon and focus on how the private sector and security industry could be more part of that whole society response. You clearly have an enormous role to play in tackling the threat from both terrorism and extremism in a number of ways. I think the history of the private sector making considerable progress over 3 decades in the commitment to design out crime is a good template. However, we need the same commitment now and corporate and social responsibility when it comes to collaborating in order to prevent terrorism. I think there is much still to do beyond the good practice examples we see at the moment around, for example, the partnering between us on terrorist financing, the work we do to develop physical protective security measures, and the ongoing development of staff awareness training. We think much more can be done collaboratively in the space of data, insider threat, and industry vigilance. I do not say this is a complete absence of this in this field, far from it. I'm pleased to say there are many good examples of effective joint working between private sector and police to counter the terrorism threat. And I'll just describe a few. For example, we've recently partnered with major sports clubs and other events organisers to help promote the ACT messages. That's our ongoing campaign about action counters terrorism. The ACT messages of vigilance and also the run, hide, tell warnings. This has included, for example, all 92 football clubs as well as Premiership rugby clubs. In the coming months, we hope to extend this to other sports ranging from motor racing to netball. We've also worked with, for example, Live Nation, who to deliver bespoke CT awareness briefings to security staff and stewards at last year's 10 largest music festivals and events. This work builds on the extensive network of our counter-terrorism security advisors who, across the country, provide protective security information and advice to public institutions, critical national infrastructure and businesses, and crowded places. Indeed, we deliver our counter-terrorism awareness training to about 100,000 people a year. And now we're looking to expand that even further, and we have now 400 companies across the UK with a combined workforce of over 2 million who've signed up to and enrolled in our self-delivery package where they can magnify the effect of that training and briefing. This will be extended then to online platforms which will be launched in mid-April and will be accessible to far greater numbers, helping to increase vigilance of millions of sports and music fans, their awareness, their willingness to help, and their levels of preparedness should the worst happen. Protective security, though, across the private sector is not simply about barriers and CCTV. It's also about social responsibility and how businesses approach the threats and challenges we face on a far wider base. By this, I'm reflecting on the fact that some companies employ tens of thousands of people, so developing training and awareness to spot the signs of extremism, radicalisation and insider threat is critical. Equally important is how these substantial workforces can be mobilised to be our eyes and ears, to be vigilant and alert. Capitalising on the emotional contract between an employee and the employer is, in my view, critical. For example, following the dreadful attack in Sousse in Tunisia in 2015, where 38 people, including 30 Britons, were murdered by a lone terrorist, the UK travel sector has worked closely with counter-terrorism policing to deliver CT safety and awareness packages with staff and to enhance the security of their customers and workforce alike. It's also struck me the leverage of that industry has helped raise the standards of security and provision for British holidaymakers in all sorts of venues across the world. We have to accept that people are far more likely to engage with their employer on this issue than they are with the police. Another good example of close working between the police and private sector is that with the financial sector. We've moved from tentative early steps decades ago, utilising a combination of relationship building, persuasion, and indeed sometimes regulation, towards a much more collaborative relationship to combat the threat at large. As well as investing in systems and processes that enable them to meet their legal responsibilities to report suspicious activity, we have seen major financial institutions become increasingly proactive in how they approach the terror threat, reaching out to us in counter-terrorism to ask what they can do to contribute and how they can help more, whilst always, of course, carefully balancing their duties to customer privacy that are their duty to uphold. The financial sector has worked with my officers on a range of counter-terrorism investigations, providing information we need to fully understand the networks that lie behind terrorist activity and try to stop the next attack before it happens. Now, whilst the financial sector has had its fair share of challenges over the last 10 years, I'm reassured by how it's responded to the issue of terrorist financing and taken proactive steps to engage with us. Sadly, despite major progress in recent months, I'm not as reassured by the level of proactivity and commitment from communication service providers about tackling the broader terrorist threat. Financial institutions are open about the fact that they will report any criminality and work with the police to prosecute offenders. Internet companies should, in my view, respond in the same manner. While the internet is a project born out of high social and ethical principles, bringing with it incredibly positive benefits for the billions of us around the world who use it, it has also enabled those who wish to undermine those same principles to further their own extremist ideology. Those extremists who utilise and occupy cyberspace have proved highly influential and dangerous actors. They have successfully encouraged, directed and enabled and promoted terrorist attacks with the click of a mouse or the tap of a screen. The online extremists seem able to act with impunity, occupying places owned and managed by legitimate and very wealthy corporations. They are effectively private tenants to their communication service provider landlords. In the real world, if a landlord knew their property was being used to plan or inspire terrorist attacks, you would expect them to show responsibility by informing the authorities and evicting them forthwith. It cannot be right that a person radicalised online by viewing illegal content on the internet, where he can talk with extremists using encrypted communications, where he can research potential targets online without leaving a trace, and where he can purchase bomb-making materials from online retailers, and where he can download instructions on how to assemble and detonate his device. It is important to recognise the good work that CSPs do in this space, though. They work closely with our specialists in our counter-terrorism internet referral unit with material notified to them. But whilst there has been some examples of good collaboration, we would like to see more. We'd like to see more, including the development of future tools and technology that will no doubt we will all rely on in future years, that these future tools and technologies should be designed with corporate social responsibility in mind, so they can not be easily exploited by extremists and terrorists. We also need proactivity from the social media companies when they identify terrorist activity on their sites. I'm disappointed in the UK, as a police service, we have yet to receive a direct referral from them when they have identified such behaviour. So we urge the private sector to think about more than the terms of profits and customer satisfaction, but also consider the wider implication of their considerable role and the influence in society they can have and how that impacts upon the safety of the public. So in conclusion, I've briefly summarised today the threat from both Islamist and right-wing terrorist and extremism, and summarised some of the operational challenges it presents to us. But I've also spoken in this time of high threats about the need for a whole society response that has the buy-in of the private sector and security industry, amongst others, to come on board. To come on board and be part of our collective efforts to protect the public and our national security. As I said last week, countries around the world are experiencing similar challenges from the twin threats of Islamist and right-wing extremism and terrorism. But I know of no other country better able to confront this threat than the UK. And I know that the private sector and security industry already play a critical role in that success, but must do even more if a whole society approach is to succeed in helping us all keep our communities safe. Thank you very much.
Before you run away, we've got a few minutes, if you wouldn't mind. If anybody has some questions for Mark earlier, it's a good opportunity to catch him, but I think Thursday is his last day in the office, so after that you'll have to find him on the golf course, well, I doubt that.
Golf's never been my thing, but no.
So I don't know if anybody has got an immediate question for Assistant Commissioner Rowley, but I do think that he made, well, obviously some very, very important points about the total society response and about the role of internet service providers. But I guess that the modern phenomenon of terrorism very much involves the individual, and getting to that individual really is a community issue, isn't it, rather than...
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think when I expanded more on how extremists are operating in communities last week, I think we have to recognise this isn't simply about ideology, it's about how they operate and undermine institutions. And I used a couple of examples. I spoke about Islamists trying to undermine education, and many here will have seen the conviction end of last week of some attack planners in London who'd infiltrated some educational institutions in East London and were trying to radicalise tens and tens of young people. And on the other side of the fence, so to speak, I also mentioned last week that we've seen examples in some towns of extreme right-wing groups creating what could best be described as whites-only food banks, where their approach to radicalising the vulnerable was to look for the sort of homeless and poor and try and draw them in on the basis that, look, we will look after you, society won't look after you, you can't trust anybody else, and we as whites need to brigade together and fight for our identity. So they're sort of different examples about how extremists are using different tactics for the same ends of dividing communities.
Mark, thank you. Philip Ingram from Grey Hair Media, freelance writing on security, intelligence and other bits and pieces. You've given us a very clear overview of the threat that you see at the moment, but a couple of things are changing out there. The so-called Islamic State are dying on the ground. We haven't had a lot of information coming out publicly about what they're doing and the threat, how it remains in this country. We've heard of Al-Qaeda on the up again, and recently the terror threat from Irish Republican terrorism was reduced on the mainland. Yet, if you look at the statistics, 2016, 2017, 8 murders, 55 bombs, 113 shootings, 80 guns recovered and 188 pounds of explosives. If that had been the mainland, yourself and the Prime Minister would have had a Cobra continuously and been on mainstream press. Would you like to comment on those threats?
So the terrorism issue centred around Ireland continuing the way you described, and I'm not going to sort of say any more on that. I think in terms of the changing nature of the global threat, it's tempting to look for tidy descriptions and tidy solutions because we're used to more conventional structures of terrorist organisations. We have Daesh or ISIS have created a much more networked approach. It's as much a cult as it is an organisation, and therefore classic language about this group is now has now been destroyed or is now about to be reformed in this part of the world. That classic language doesn't work. We see networks across the world to other groups that claim allegiance. We've seen British links on operations to Libya and back to sort of the Afghanistan area in the last year. So the complexity of the picture is much greater than I think is widely described. That means prediction is very difficult. If we look across the world, there are many locations where state governance is weak, and it provides an opportunity for terrorism to foster, and terrorist groups operating in those spaces connect across the world. So we're going to see a much more organic and evolving picture that is hard to predict. But Islamist networks, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, or whatever else follows, will continue to be a significant challenge.
Well, thank you again for your talk, and very good luck for the future. And I'm afraid you're not going to escape the counter-terrorism world at all. You'll be doing that repeatedly. But let's give a round of applause, not just for what Mark said this morning, but for his service to us all over the last years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now to introduce Sir Julian King, the last British Commissioner, at least for this iteration of the European Union. Sir Julian's been involved as Commissioner for Security now for 18 months, And it's, of course, a key post, because security is one of those issues that all members of the European Union can agree is absolutely vital to the success of the endeavour. You can't do very much if you aren't secure in your homeland. A lot depends, I think, on the way that conversations go in Europe as to the sharing of information. One of the key problems, but also one of the key opportunities of a strong union is, of course, to share information, to understand the challenge that faces everybody, and to do something about it jointly. And I would like now to ask Julian to come to the microphone and tell us a little bit, perhaps particularly, about the information systems that are being developed within Europe to cope with the threat. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you in particular for asking me not to focus on Brexit, but to have a discussion about what we're trying to do collectively at the European level to help and support member states and member state authorities to deal with some of the threats that we've just been hearing about. Because the threat picture, not only from terrorism but also from cyber, remains really quite a challenge. We've just heard, I think very eloquently, about the threat picture from terrorism here in the UK. Obviously, there have been a series of terrorist attacks, jihadi extremists, essentially across European countries, Finland, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, France, and Germany, as well as here in the UK. There have also been some major cyber attacks that have disrupted our economies and, in some cases, our politics as well. Responding effectively to these threats does, as you've just suggested, require ever closer cooperation between authorities at all levels. National governments, national authorities are in the front line. It is first and foremost a national responsibility to prevent attacks, to deal with the aftermath of attacks, and indeed to apprehend perpetrators. But there is more that can, and I would say, should be done at the European level to organize ourselves to help and support those national authorities. So working with the member states in Brussels at the EU level, we are seeking to improve, in particular, information sharing that can help police and border guards to assess and investigate threats, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But we're also closing down the space in which terrorists and others who wish us ill can operate, making it harder for them to get access to money, to firearms, to try and make sure that they can exchange best practice, to fund some of their work, and something which I hadn't fully appreciated, but which I appreciate now, to give them a sense of help and support, because this can be quite lonely long-term work. And through something called the Radicalization and Awareness Network, we've been doing that for some years. It's also a resource to tackle new aspects of the problem. So there is now, as was touched upon earlier, a new aspect of the returning foreign terrorist fighters problem, which is non-combatant women and children. There's very limited experience of what to do and how to deal with not only the security but the social challenges that can pose. And some member states are going to face quite large numbers, potentially, of returning non-combatant women and children, and they want to work together to try and see how they can deal with that problem. We can help and support that. There is one area of tackling radicalization, again touched on earlier this morning, where I think it does make sense to work together as a European Union, and that is dealing with radicalization online. Because when you have some of these big internet platforms in front of you, I think it does help to incentivize them to go a little bit faster in dealing with this problem if they're thinking about 28 markets rather than a single market. And if they realize that unless together on a voluntary basis we're able to make the rapid progress that is absolutely called for in identifying and taking this content down, they face a real risk of fragmentation and 28 different sorts of legislation, which is in no one's interest. So both on the ground and online, we have been prioritizing our work in countering radicalization.
Thank you again, Julian. Thanks for your time, thanks for coming, and thanks for your speech.
Thank you very much.
Right. Well, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Mike McGarrity, whose very illustrious career with the FBI, including working in New York, which is a sort of epicenter of, I guess, FBI activity, or has been in many ways over the years in counterterrorism, but also with the joint counterterrorism structure within the United States, with many of the other agencies involved. So an excellent guy to tell us how it should be done. Thank you.
We'll see. Let me preface a couple things. One, as the first American speaker up here, I'm going to be a little risky and use a PowerPoint. The only thing I ask is if you don't take any photos of it. We asked if we could push it out. Certainly you can take notes, but we just ask that you not take any photos of it, because when that gets out online, then it creates questions for me back. The second thing is to give you a little preface of why I'm standing here. I'm actually standing here because my predecessor committed to coming and speaking at this forum, and he left. I've been in the job 3.5 weeks. So that said, 22 years in the FBI, came out of the New York office. I've worked on the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York. I was a detailee to the CIA Counterterrorism Center of the Bin Laden Unit. We did not get Bin Laden when I was there, the movie's a couple years later. I was in charge of our extraterritorial squad at Washington Field Office, so all al-Qaeda senior leadership in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Israel at the time. A year at the White House on the National Security Council. So I've gone back and forth, but I'll tell you, just 5 weeks ago, my main threat that I was working was MS-13 gangs in New York City and out on Long Island. And it's an interesting thing how the Bureau looks at counterterrorism, and we'll get into it when I get into the slides, but frankly, the threat's changed, and I'll get into the evolving threat from 9/11 to the present. It's very much like a criminal, as far as our strategy. Our strategy after 9/11 was collect. We're an intelligence agency. Certainly we do that, but as you see the target change when I get into it, we don't have the luxury of collecting for long, nor are these people talking to each other in a conspiratorial nature that we saw in years past. So first, how we define it. First of all, for the FBI, our mission is worth stating, is protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. Within that framework, counterterrorism is the #1 priority, has been, will be, and continue to be, despite what you might see in the media as far as what's on the media. We've pretty much been quiet over the last couple of years as far as our apparatus and our response. Within the counterterrorism, we are set up, we look at it, international terrorism, domestic terrorism. International terrorism, certainly designated foreign terrorist organizations, those designated by the State Department and others, al-Qaeda, ISIS, also state sponsors of terrorism, and the new one, the homegrown violent extremists, which I'll really get into in my presentation on why we look at them as the #1 threat in the United States right now. Separately, domestic terrorism. These are extremists who are in the U.S. These persons are committed to an ideology or political or social ideology. They're within a group. Interestingly enough, we arrest more of these individuals per year than we do international terrorism subjects. We also see they're not conspiratorial in nature. They might conspire, but when they act, it's usually solo. If you look at here, 1,000 cases, so 1,000 homegrown violent extremist cases, 1,000 ISIS investigations, 1,000 DT. We also have al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, other type cases as well. Here's the evolution of the threat, and partly the reason why I thought it was important to come here again, only first couple weeks, it gave me an opportunity to meet with my UK partners yesterday. As I'm learning how the FBI over the years has really worked this threat, you actually learn more about yourself and your own organization when you go to a foreign partner and start asking them questions. So I've certainly learned a lot about the challenges the UK are having, same challenges we're having back in the US with this evolving threat, and I'm going to go back to the US with a lot more questions for my people. So I don't think they're going to be happy I came. But here's an interesting thing to look at, and this is how we look at the threat. Now, 2018, the way we work in the Bureau, that's fiscal year 2018. It was October 31st, 9/11. I actually worked in 6 World Trade Center, which is connected to the North Tower. I was there on 9/11. I was working drugs and gangs. So after that, I joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That was a complex, multi-plane, many co-conspirators in that attack. 2,600 people died in the towers, plus the plane, plus the firefighters, plus law enforcement. It was external plotting from overseas. Now, October 31st, which is Halloween in New York City, I was there working criminal matters, but I responded to the scene only a couple, again, at this time, only a couple blocks from the office. So I was in charge of the crime scene down below, much different intact, SIPOF, radicalized, mobilized fairly quickly, used a truck, a Home Depot rental truck, pretty much followed the ISIS playbook of use a car, when you get out, use a gun if you can, use a knife, keep going, and he had a manifesto. One person, multi-complex attack to one person, 800 yards away. From this street corner, I could see the Freedom Tower, certainly 16 plus years later. And for me, that was a moment I said I would come back to terrorism. And for me, that street corner was a defining moment. How we view the homegrown violent extremist threat, certainly inspired by the global jihad. When I was working international terrorism back in 2005, I thought it was very interesting looking at the UK threat and the US threat. You had 2004, 2005 threats in the US that started to hit New York City. Isla al-Hindi during Barat, the threat to the financial markets in New York City. But they really didn't get there. They certainly went, scoped out things, but the attack didn't happen. I always thought we were about 5 years behind the UK threat at that point. And we had an ocean. Well, the internet, and inspired by the global jihad, the ocean doesn't matter anymore with the internet. You can be inspired online. Most of our homegrown violent extremists, I'm going to get into what the profile looks like, and I think it's going to be pretty clear why it's such a hard threat for us to work. Inspired by global jihad, they're based in the U.S., radicalized primarily in the U.S. Certainly certain individuals are looking to travel, but most of the ones we're arresting are not. They're actually in the U.S., born in the U.S., and radicalized there. And they're not directly collaborating with foreign terrorist organizations. Certainly the ISIS propaganda that's out there can be used to inspire them, but what we saw, even in the last 3 years compared to 2015, they're not in contact as much with the ISIS or the foreign terrorist organizations. They're just inspired by the global jihad. Again, 1,000 cases here, all